Hi everyone and welcome. I am joined today by one of my favorite guests, Chas Freeman, who was previously the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, also known as the former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. But for today's topic, it's also very interesting that he was the Director of Chinese Affairs at the US State Department and also with Kissinger when he opened up China. So, yeah, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be with you, Glenn. A minor correction. I wrote the papers that Kissinger relied upon for his secret trip in 1971. I think July 9 to 11, 1971 to Beijing. But I wasn't on the trip. I didn't have a stomach ache and retreat to a hill station in Pakistan and fly off to somewhere else.
Okay, well, um, nonetheless, I think a lot of this experience is of great importance. But, well, I guess back in those days, the opening up of China obviously had a clear purpose of splitting up the Soviets and the Chinese, but also, working relationship between the United States and China. The deals that were made, such as One China policy, all of this has laid the foundation for what the peace and cooperation between the Americans and Chinese have been since. And the topic I want to discuss with you today is the growing rivalry between the US and China. So far, it's primarily in the economic realm, but of course, it could escalate, well, hopefully not into the military sphere. But I thought it's good to start maybe with a bit of an open or wide question, which is uh, that you've complained that there are in the United States there's often a lack of knowledge about China, which is why we often lean into stereotypes. And what do you see as being the main misperceptions about China today? What is it that the political establishment in the United States don't understand about China?
Where to begin? The number of delusions, misperceptions is quite large. And unfortunately, of course, Americans these days are quite insular. I remember being told at the end of by Arnaud de Bosgrave, who was a well-known journalist, war correspondent in World War II, that in 1947 there were, I think, 2,700 US foreign correspondents for a newspaper scene that was very fragmented. Almost every newspaper had its own foreign correspondent. And Americans were really quite well informed about the world. Today, there are less than 100 foreign correspondents for the United States, which is why when you hear the news, if it's about something abroad, you're probably hearing a BBC stringer or someone. So we're not very well informed generally. Our schools no longer teach geography. People joke that Americans learn geography by going to war with wherever it is. And but mainly, we have gone through a series of phases. We had an entente with China, never an alliance, a limited cooperation for limited purposes, driven entirely by geopolitical considerations. The Chinese were already split from the Soviets, and they were under pressure from Moscow. There was a real danger of a preemptive Soviet invasion of China in the 1960s. At the end of the 60s, there was actual fighting, and President Nixon had the wit to see that we could enlist China in support of the containment of the USSR, which is what we did. That was an entente. Perhaps maybe China was a sort of protected state in the sense that it had been in World War II when we supported the Chinese government against Japan, mainly not because we had any expectation that China could defeat Japan, but we had the hope that it would tie down a vast number of Japanese forces who might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. So it was a strategic move. The continued independence of China was strategically important to us. And the same was true in the Cold War. But when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union imploded, after the Berlin Wall came down, we no longer had a common enemy. And simultaneously, this is all, I think the crucial year was 1989. The Berlin Wall came down, of course, in November. In June, there was the student and worker revolt in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, which was put down with force. That drained all the warmth from the US-China relationship. And finally, that year was also the year that Taiwan ceased to be a Leninist dictatorship and became a democracy. So we had suddenly three forces directing us toward antipathy to China. The geopolitical argument for cooperation had apparently disappeared. The ideological equation of Taipei with Beijing had disappeared because Taipei was no longer Leninist while Beijing remained so. And of course, there were the lingering effects of anti-communism, containment, the experiences of the Korean and Vietnam War. All these things are still with us. So I believe that we are hamstrung in for foreign relations by the absence of a detailed vocabulary for describing relationships. And I've gone around some of them. Alliances are unconditional commitments to mutual assistance. Ententes are conditional contingent relationships, which envisage some kind of limited cooperation, or perhaps for a limited time. Client states basically derive protection from affording the other country, the larger one, privileges, prerogatives, and a lot of international relations are simply give and take on an equal basis, very transactional. But when you get to the varieties of competition or confrontation, I think there are four. First is rivalry, which you mentioned. I'd be very cautious about that word because I think it basically means a healthy competition. That is one in which you try to outdo the other by improving yourself. It's like going to a track meet. If you run on the track, and you beat the other side, the other people, it's because you've trained better, you're physically stronger, you're faster, not because they are weaker or whatever, or because you sabotage them. Because after rivalry, we have what I call adversarial antagonism. That is where you seek to win by tripping or hamstringing the other party on the track, not by excelling yourself, but by injuring the other side so that it can't match you. And then finally, if you carry that far enough, you enter the realm of enmity, where your objective is the annihilation of the other side. We saw that in the Cold War, constrained by a fear of nuclear exchanges. So where we are with China is we've gone through the whole circle from protected state status in World War II and again in the Cold War, Entente, cooperation in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation, transactional relationship, rivalry, very healthy competition. And now we're at adversarial antagonism. And our objective is to hold China down, if possible, push it back. And that is, of course, impossible because we have limited capacity to do that, and China is going ahead on its own. So I'm sorry about the long-winded response, but this is a very strategically very complex relationship. We've just seen the United States and China engage in serious economic warfare and then achieve apparently some sort of relaxation of tensions, limited, a détente, if you will. But it's not a truce. We haven't given up the antagonism. It's not a ceasefire. We're not going to stop taking steps against each other. All it is a reduction in the intensity of the confrontation, while we see if we can reach some kind of longer term understanding that ends the trade war, or at least confines it within limits, a sort of arms control agreement, if you will. But we're not, the Trump administration portrays this as a major victory for its maximum pressure tactics. It's not. The Chinese didn't want tariffs. They retaliated. The United States is now backed down.
Well, I appreciate you differentiating between rivalry and antagonism because it does. Well, I'm quite supportive and hopeful about American industrial policies to strengthen its technological sovereignty and competitiveness. But there is something else, though, which is this. If that was enough, I think the U.S. could have take its time to do gradual build up and
Mhm.
reindustrialize all of the things which I think should be done. But it appears that a lot of these policies go into overdrive because the objective isn't simply to become more competitive, but also, as you said, to break China as well. So that's beyond the competition. It seems to, but this need to break China, is this does this go to the ideology or the view of the world then? Because if there was a willingness to essentially share the stage with China as an equal, the U.S. could have a more moderate industrial policy in terms of just rebuilding its own strength, not necessarily again breaking the knees of the Chinese. Is this does this go to ideology? How do you explain the I guess the demand for primacy in this relationship?
Well, I think the driver of all this is psychological distress at losing primacy. That is, around 1870, the United States became the largest economy in the world, and in the 20th century, we became, by stages, the dominant political and military force in the world, as well as the dominant financial power and for a long time, economic power. Now we see China, if you measure the GDP of the two countries by the proper standard for comparison, which is um, uh, purchasing power parity, not nominal exchange rates, which fluctuate and which represent extraneous factors. Then China's economy is already 1/3 larger than ours. It produces over 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods. We produce about 15% now. Um, and it is very embedded in the Bretton Woods post-World War II institutions, for example, the World Trade Organization, which we have walked away from. So we have the ironic situation that the Chinese are defending the world order that we created while trying to tweak it a bit into their advantage, of course. And we are acting destructively. And in this context, we don't pay any attention to the UN Charter, international law. We've sabotaged the World Trade Organization. We've walked out of various specialized UN bodies when we don't like what the global majority decides. And we are becoming more isolated. China is becoming more engaged. So this is what is happening. As to restoring competitiveness, which I think is an entirely appropriate goal, I think we have to, recognize some economic realities. First of all, what's happened in industry is exactly what happened in agriculture. So in 1900, I don't know the situation in Norway, but in 1900 in the United States, roughly 80% of the population worked on the farm to produce food. Now it's less than 1%, and we produce more food than ever. That is because capital has substituted for labor. That is, people have become more productive because they've mechanized agriculture. They've also introduced science and bred better varieties of plants that are more resistant to disease and so forth, give higher yields. And the same is true with the animal population. So what is happening in industry is exactly the same thing. I said 1900, 80% worked in agriculture, 15% or so were in industry, 5% were in what was called services, a very vague category. But if you look at the situation now, you'll find less than 1% in agriculture, 8% in industry. That is half of the percentage of 125 years ago. And there too, automation, robotics, various techniques for managing production, beginning with the assembly line, Henry Ford's invention, and continuing through multiple stages, have made the American worker vastly more productive. So far fewer people are needed to produce much more goods. We actually produce more than ever, but our employment in industry is going down. And finally, we have, so that's 91, let's see, 15, that is 8%, 1%. That is 91% are in something called services, which has essentially become a meaningless category and needs to be re-examined by economists. They invented that category in the 1930s along with GDP, badly needs a theoretical re-examination. So we're seeing the same things happening in China. Agricultural workforce is declining rapidly. The industrial workforce industrial jobs are going down. We see unemployment now in China among youth who were educated for an industrial economy that now no longer requires them. So what is the relevance of all this? Well, things are happening in the United States which produce a great deal of angst, disquiet. And rather than looking at the causes of these, which are intrinsic to progress, we blame foreigners. So who is the perfect foreigner to blame? China. Why? Because we have a history of anti-Chinese sentiment. We have a history of a containment of China in the Cold War. It's run by something that calls itself the Communist Party. We imagine that if you've seen one communist, you've seen them all. The people who make these statements about China and communism and so forth have neither met a Chinese or never been to China, nor have they ever met a communist of any kind, except the Vietnamese, who are anti-Chinese and therefore good people, despite their misguided ideology. So there are many factors going into this, but the bottom line is we have a very distorted view of China, inadequate press coverage, biased editorial policies in our media, a political establishment that has made China the enemy of choice. So we are in a very strange position. You can't have an effective policy negotiating position or competition if you misunderstand with whom you are competing. And we fairly fundamentally do. On top of this, you mentioned industrial policy. The Chinese have come up with a very effective pattern of industrial policy, which basically relies on policy banks that lend to support national objectives. You get strange things when you do this to some extent. For example, a Chinese company acquired most of Pirelli, the Italian tire maker, under the Belt and Road Initiative because it was able to portray that as somehow related to the Belt and Road. I find that rather far-fetched, but apparently one of the policy banks was prepared to support it with lending. So you have essentially Deng Xiaoping's idea that if you want to get across the river, you have an objective. You just tell people, you get across the river, I don't care how you do it. If you get there, it'll be worth your while financially. So he came up with the idea of feeling your way across the river with your toes on the rocks. That's what the Chinese do. They announce an objective. Let's say we need an electric economy We need renewable energy. And they say, and if you invest in these things, we'll back you financially. So the result is, over 50% of the hydroelectric power under construction is in China. 70% of the solar power under construction is in China. Similar pattern for wind power. And of course, China leads in electric vehicles. It also leads in high voltage transmission systems. It leads in the efficiency of electric power production and so forth. I could take other examples because China is now ahead in the vast majority of technologies, something which we don't understand. We imagine export controls can preserve our precious bodily fluids from being drained by the Chinese from us. If you remember Dr. Strangelove, he's alive and well in Washington somewhere, and even if Kissinger is dead.
Well, I was going to say the tendency to blame foreign powers for domestic ills is also something we're seeing a lot in Europe these days as well. But I
In
thought what it
Europe,
was.
you blame the Swedes for all your problems.
Well, well, pointing more towards the Russians these days, but yeah. Well, what was always for me unique about American nationalism, though, is that it was unlike the nationalism around the world, because nationalism often the uglier form tends to be look towards when was your greatness and why did it end and who's to blame. So you go through history and see who robbed you of your greatness. Now, I guess what's always been exceptional about the American nationalism is that it's been usually very positive. That is, with the assumption that its greatest days are ahead of it, it comes off as more benign, again, optimistic. But perhaps this is because the United States always gone from strength to strength. But now, of course, in relative decline, it appears that the Americans are kind of following the call it the European path, where we where it looks towards when was this golden age, who took it away, and then China is identified, and one ends up with these narratives that the Chinese took our jobs. Not that it was outsourced, but took it. But it does beg the question, though, if it's a challenge for the United States a bit how to do capitalism itself. Again, we're in a bit of a strange situation given that officially, the Chinese are led by the Communist Party, but its form of capitalism appears to resemble to a large extent what America had in the 19th century, very industrial capitalism,
Right.
where it limits the rent seekers, seek to harmonize, make sure that society doesn't become an appendage of a free market. Uh, do you do you see the United States needing to change how it does capitalism itself? And if so, do you
Yes,
think China is a model, or is it not appropriate for the US anymore?
I don't think China presents a model for the United States, in particular because of its strong Leninist character. It's not compatible with the European Enlightenment values that the United States long tried to exemplify, and which are being now asserted against a very authoritarian presidency in the United States. So I don't think there's certain things that work for the Chinese. After all, this is a society of 1.5 billion people. Nobody has ever really effectively governed anything that large before. The Chinese have multiple experiences of what they call luan, chaos, anarchy, a cultural revolution being a recent case in point. And they put a huge emphasis on order. So would we if we had the constraints that the Chinese do. For example, the United States has about 1/4 as many people, less than that actually, than as the Chinese, but we have 4 times as much agricultural land. They have 7% of the world's water supply. We have something like 25, 27%. We have a terrific endowment. Our neighbors, as Bismarck said, are the meek and mild and polite Canadians to the north and the happy-go-lucky Mexicans to the south, neither of whom pose a challenge. Well, they didn't anyway. We're working on that. But and to our east and west, our neighbors are fish. China borders 14 countries with which it's had multiple conflicts over the years. for 600 of the past 1,000 years, China was ruled by foreigners. So this is a very different history. And if we had the same arable land to population ratio that the Chinese do, we would have 4 billion people in the United States. Most of them in California, probably, so I don't worry about it too much. I'm on the East Coast. These are differences, even if you don't get to history. And I think we misunderstand the history of East Asia in terms of European models. Europe is the bloodiest continent of all, followed closely by the subcontinent of India. These are both extensions of the Eurasian landmass that have multiple languages, cultures, and so forth bumping up against each other. They both produce warring states. China had that period in the pre-Christian era, and it got over it. And the situation in East Asia never resembled that in Europe. Countries deferred to China because of its size, its intellectual and scientific prowess, its prosperity, its good government. But China didn't go out and conquer them. So there are exceptions, Vietnam being a key one. Some Korean history also involves Chinese conquest, or conquest from what is now China. But I think we fundamentally misunderstand this history. And I'm not sure the Chinese understand their own history either. Or if they do, it's encapsulated in the phrase, "we will never be hegemonic." I think China is the only country that says that. In the 19th century, the United States said that. We will never be imperialists. But manifest destiny never stopped. We overthrew the monarchy in Hawaii and incorporated that into our country. Then we went on to the Philippines and Guam and so forth, and we south to Puerto Rico and Cuba. And so the Chinese are saying we will never be imperialist. But I think we have to be a bit skeptical about whether they will not fall into the same trap that we did.
Yeah, no, this was a key thing for the United States, especially 19th century. They wouldn't become like the Europeans. I think this is why in 1898, when the US defeated the Spanish and acquired a lot of its colonial possessions, as you said, including Philippines, that this is something that created a distaste by a large part of US society. Mark Twain, for example, and others arguing that empire was not, that it was wasting its soul by pursuing the European path. But it is interesting though, because this it's a common argument that China would behave fundamentally different from the United States, but it's I guess two different perspectives. I know, for example, Jeffrey Sachs makes this point that there's something internally different there. On the other hand, then you have the Mersheimer argument arguing it's all external. So in other words, if the hegemon presents itself as an opportunity, then essentially the ideologies and ideas supporting it would follow. So the Chinese might also have their imperial moment, if you will. But how do you see China's policies going forward? Do you think it will begin to pursue more, I guess, imperial ambitions, and what do you think that we fail to recognize as in terms of other motivations for the United States, so for China, because it is a common theme, I think, not just for the US but also for the Europeans, the lack of ability these days to recognize the security concerns and interests of opponents. In the past, this would be the point of departure in any discussion, but when do we ever discuss the security or interest of Iran or Russia or China? We stopped discussing this concerns of our adversaries. But how do you see this then? Do you see China acting on its security concerns, or do you think more hegemonic impulses might play in? Sorry, that was a very long question.
No, it's a very interesting, multi-layered question, and let me make a few comments on the United States before I talk about China. Mark Twain and others who argued against American imperialism were correct. It ultimately turned out to be incompatible with American democracy. And we're seeing that now. Second point is we invented a new sort of empire, which was an empire not of occupation so much as a protection racket, if you will. We were protecting everybody against somebody else. That seems to be the genius of American foreign policy, that we have an irresistible impulse to protect everybody from everybody else. This gets us into trouble. We also have a tradition born of our experience in war, which is very unusual. In our Civil War, in World War I, World War II, and again in the Cold War, we imagined that the objective was unconditional surrender of the other side, followed by its moral reconstruction. So that's what we did, in our Civil War. We occupied the South and tried to rebuild it in a different way. And we did that after World War I with Germany. And after World War II, we again tried to pursue unconditional surrender. Finally, the Soviet Union imploded of its own defects. And then there was an argument, well, we need to help it, repent of its sins and become morally superior. But we weren't willing to invest the money in that. So, and Jeffrey Sachs and others did some things that weren't very helpful in that regard. I say that despite my admiration for Jeffrey Sachs' current views. So on the case of China, I think what the Chinese want is not the sort of empire we had. They seem to regard alliances, which are in effect protection of other states, not as aggregating power to them, adding to their power and influence, but as liabilities that can get them into trouble. So they really don't have any allies. They have a protected state relationship with North Korea, which is a buffer state between American forces and Japanese forces from their perspective. And they have a similar protected state relationship with Pakistan, which is driven by the desire to offset the otherwise inevitable Indian hegemony in South Asia. Tibet, of course, is part of South Asia. So the Chinese have a legitimate concern about the balance of power in South Asia. And that's why they back Pakistan. So they know how to play geopolitical games, that's clear. But I think what they seek is not control. They're certainly not seeking Lebensraum for a population that is contracting rather than growing. They don't want to bring in more Koreans or Vietnamese or other foreigners. What they want, they don't seek control of natural resources militarily. They've learned the lesson that you can buy what you need if you pay enough. So I think what they want is respect for their dignity as an independent major civilizational state. Of course, they're flattered if others wish to emulate them, but they don't insist on this, unlike the United States. The American position is, if you want to deal with us, you have to become like us. Chinese position is, you're foreigners, we're happy you're foreigners, stay that way, please. We don't care what you do, as long as we can make money and you don't injure our dignity. So I think we're talking about a very different approach to world order. And it may have imperial aspects, but they're not the same as the ones that the British or French empires or the Russian Empire, for that matter, or the American quasi-empire pursued. So I don't know where China is going to end up. I think in the competition realm, the major difference that I notice, and I think the thing we really need to focus on, is that according to the OECD, in 2030, which is only 5 years from now, 37% of the world's STEM workforce will be Chinese. 37%. 26% will be Indian. 4.5% will be Russian. 4.2% will be American. Now, that is not a recipe for success in rivalry, as I define it, as healthy competition, which is why we have been driven into adversarial antagonism in the way that we have. But the bottom line is, if we want to compete, if we want to excel, if we want to remain, if not the primary power in the world, one of several primary powers in the world, we need to do what the Chinese did: reform and opening. We're doing the opposite. We're doubling down on our current economic structure. We're not pursuing antitrust policy. This is an outdated observation, but as you may know, I chair an international company on the side when I'm not living in the Giza warehouse in New Hampshire. And years ago, I did some things in the furniture business. At that time, there were 120 furniture companies in the United States, most of them owned by the Manoogian family in Detroit, Armenian Americans, who are the descendants of the man who invented the Delta faucet, the lever that controls hot and cold coming out of your faucet in your bathroom, and made a fortune. In China, there were 50,000 furniture companies, and they were engaged in cutthroat competition. So you mentioned 19th century capitalism. In market economic terms, that's the Chinese model. It's not the great state-owned enterprises that are the driving force in the economy. It's the multitude of competing smaller entities that is. And so we see that the greatest advance in artificial intelligence recently is from DeepSeek, which is a private thing, had nothing to do with the government, didn't even get any subsidies. It was basically a company that had an algorithm that was doing trading shares on the Shanghai stock market until the government outlawed that algorithm, and they had to figure out what to do with their technology, and they went into AI very successfully, apparently. So we're confronting. We're in a competition which isn't military, although we choose to treat it as such. It's primarily economic and technological. And the key to winning that is domestic economic opening and reform. And we're not doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think these are important, parts of what China actually does, because there's often not widespread recognition that China is very strong or strictly against alliances. This is something they insist on. I mean, I'm sure the Russians would be much more open to a Chinese-Russian alliance, but for the Chinese, they don't want any alliances. They made this abundantly clear. It's been a very long-standing policy, and as you said, they also reject the universalism that is, which opens up for hegemony. That is, if you are for liberal democratic universalism, then you can claim the right to represent the freedom of other peoples. The Chinese, they keep insisting on civilizational distinctiveness, that one civilization should not tell another one how to develop. Now, that's at least on an ideological level, that's contradictory. Well, it contradicts the principle or the foundation for hegemony. Also, it's interesting the extent to which this economy is decentralized. My last question, though, is about if the United States wants to contain China. It appears as some of the policies over the past, well, at least weeks, if not months, has been maybe contradictory. So I looked then, well, a lesser extent, Taiwan, the threats to shift all of its, to have all the semiconductor industries moved to the US, but I thought more the alienation of Japan, because Japan's always been very, maybe subservient is a strong word, but it's been a very loyal ally, at least, to the United States. But we see now in this tariff war that the Japanese have been using some very strong language, that they don't think the word was, they don't want to be extorted by the United States. So this is, to some extent unprecedented, or new at least. Do you see the possibility of with the uncertain future of the United States, or at least it's trying to find a new place in the international economy. Do you see a possibility of Japan now seeking to, well, not switch sides, this doesn't work, but at least diversify its economic partners and open up a bit more to China, if not to gain leverage from within negotiations with the United States? Or at least you see China, Japan changing its relationship?
Yes, but there are tremendous difficulties. There's a great deal of emotional distress involved on both sides for different reasons. The Chinese believe to count 35 million dead at the hands of the Japanese between 1931 and 1945, a 14-year rampage through China by Imperial Japan. Whether the number is that high or not is a matter of dispute. But virtually every family in Central, East, and North China lost someone in that conflagration. And this is not really understood in the West. We know, some of us know anyway, that the Russians sacrificed terribly, or the Soviets rather, because it wasn't just Russians in the contest with the Nazis. But we don't really know about the land war in Asia. The story is of American victory in the Pacific over the Japanese Navy. So Japan is back as an independent power more and more. It will not bow to the United States. It had the experience of doing so in the Plaza Accords in the 1980s, which set Japan on a course of economic stagnation from which it has never really fully recovered. And it's not going to repeat this experience. And it recognizes, Japan does, as the Chinese do, that this contest is less about economics than it is about power grab or psychological intimidation or subordination to the United States. And Japan has recovered a bit of its national pride, and it's not going to do that. So what we see is the Japanese acting proactively in a number of spheres. For example, after the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership under Mr. Trump in the first term, although the Democrats also proposed to withdraw, Japan took over the project. And the current variant of that reflects Japanese leadership in Pacific Asia. Japan has also become more active politically and militarily. Just the other day, 2 Japanese frigates turned up in the Cambodian port that the Chinese just completed, which is supposedly a Chinese base, but isn't. It's a base that can accommodate military vessels. But the first major vessels to go there were not Chinese, they were Japanese. Japan has got an active military aid program for Vietnam and the Philippines aimed at balancing China. And it is actively pursuing greater engagement, not just with South Korea and Indonesia, important industrial powers in the region, or with Europe, but also with China. So Japan is becoming what I call a node in the new multinodal international architecture. That is, it acts independently. It can accommodate thick and thin connections to other countries. It can change those connections. It exists in 3 dimensions. It is not a pole at the end of a 2-dimensional connecting line. So we see that Japan emerging, along with many others. And one of the checks on Chinese hegemony, I believe, aside from the ideological one that you mentioned, where the Chinese have an ancient tradition of Mencius, Mengzi, who said that if you want international influence, you must become a good society that people want to emulate. Don't go out and try to sell yourself. Be virtuous, and others will want to be like you and will want to learn from you. That was the American view in the 19th century. The lurch into imperialism, unfortunately, cured us of that. The Chinese confront a world in which middle-ranking powers, including some in their own Pacific Asian region, are now increasingly balancing multiple relationships, diversifying their relationships, not cleaving solely to one protector, namely in Pacific Asia, the United States. But we see this, in West Asia with the reemergence of Turkey as a very independent, rather unpredictable actor. We see the French trying to reassert an independent role within Europe and beyond it. We see Saudi Arabia emerging as a middle-ranking power in its own right, given its hydrocarbons and financial clout. We see Indonesia as a rising potential great power. India, of course, remains studiously non-aligned. We see in Latin America the rise of a concept called active non-alignment, which means we're not going to stick just with the United States or subject ourselves to the Monroe Doctrine constraints. We reserve the right to build a relationship with the European Union, with China, with India, with Japan, and so forth. So we see a world in which I describe as increasingly multinodal. I think polarity, thinking on the basis of polarity, just doesn't fit with this emerging world. I don't know how it's going to end up looking, but it doesn't seem to be compatible with any sort of polarity, G2, G3, certainly not a single dominant power. And a final comment, because this is directly relevant, we can't stop China from becoming the center of its own region. We've defaulted already on the trade and economic element of this when we withdrew from TPP. We're not part of any of the rulemaking councils in the region, which are composed of countries in the region. India, by the way, has foolishly excluded itself from that. But the Chinese are very much part of that. Everybody's trade in the region is directed at China or from China. And that's not going to change. Technologically, as I indicated, we're losing the bipolar race with China. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which evaluates who's doing the most innovation, evaluates 64 areas of technology. They claim that China's now ahead in 57, South Korea in 2, and the United States in 5. So the technological competition is not, we are drifting away from that. Export controls don't help. Persecution of scientists of Asian Chinese origin does not help. The barriers to student exchange do not help. And so finally, we're left with the military side. That's all we have now. And there, people are hedging. They don't want to be involved in a war with China. And they certainly don't want to get involved in finishing the Chinese Civil War. We have to remember that the Taiwan issue is the product of the defeated side of the Chinese Civil War retreating to Taiwan under American protection and remaining there under American protection, separate from the rest of China. So the United States is in the odd position of acknowledging one China. There's only one China, and Taiwan's part of China. But on the other hand, preventing a negotiated solution of the Chinese Civil War, because every time the Chinese make an offer, we up the ante with military assistance that gives people in Taiwan who don't want to negotiate the excuse not to. So this is a very confused policy, and it's not one that is advancing American interests or really enlisting the countries of the region in some sort of joint or shared opposition to China. They're all interested in America, helping them, backing them as they work out a long-term viable relationship with the country that is at the center of their region.
And I think the impulse often in Washington to warn other countries about not trading with China or decoupling, that is often seen, I guess, incorrectly through the lens of bloc politics. But it's the reason why I think a majority of the world is quite welcoming of China's rise is not that they want to subordinate themselves to a Chinese bloc versus American, but it's what it represents when you have many centers of power. What promise this gives to states around the world is the ability to diversify. If you trade with both China and the US as well as others, you can have more independent economic policy, which translates into more political autonomy. I think this is why it's so attractive. I think often the impulse to prevent countries from diversifying, it's seen as almost an assault on political autonomy.
Well, the net effect of the changes that I've described in the world order, which give greater freedom of maneuver to middle-sized and smaller countries within an increasingly diverse polynodal, if you will, system, gives smaller and medium-sized countries agency that they didn't have. It gives them the freedom to pursue their own development in the way they wish. So in this connection, the American position is a losing one, because the Chinese say, how you develop is up to you. We don't have anything to say about that. If you want to learn from us, go ahead. You want to learn from someone else, so that doesn't bother us. And we say you have to conform to our way or the highway, and the other issue is that the Chinese are not trying to block the U.S. From selling goods or services anywhere, and we're trying to block them. As someone said, I think it was Larry Summers said, he heard from an African interlocutor, that when the Chinese come, they offer roads and dams and electrification, and when you come, you insist that we conform to your political stances, and you offer us nothing. So which is going to win? If the United States is going to be successful in remain the great power, the overwhelmingly superior power that we have been, we need not only to reform domestically, we need to change our foreign policy to recognize the interests of other countries and try to serve them or surf those interests rather than resist them. Someone said, when the winds of change blow, some people build walls to keep the wind out. Other people build windmills. We need to build windmills. And so I think the Chinese challenge is correctly described by the European Union as systemic. It is a systemic challenge. It's a choice between an open world of many different paths to modernity and a closed world, which is dominated by protectionism. And by the way, I don't think that tariffs are going to reindustrialize the United States. But that is one of the many ways in which the weird has been normalized theoretically in my country.
Yeah. Well, I see a lot of self-defeating policies on both sides of the Atlantic these days, so a lot of self-harm. Anyways, I hope people in Washington still pays attention to you as we can maybe reduce some of this self-harm. Anyways, thank you so much again for your time. Yeah, always learn from listening to you, so thanks again.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I apologize for the convoluted nature of my responses to your very simple questions.
No, that's what makes it interesting, so thank you so much. Bye.